Okay, let's start. My name's Tony Pappert. You're watching LaRouche PAC's Saturday evening class for December 2nd, 2023. And our speaker is Barbara Boyd, well known to many of you, whom I'm going to be interviewing on a major breaking development just this week in the spy war against the American people by governments, by both our own and British government. It was the subject of a post which Barbara put up, which I'll make available in the chat. The post was also part of the email many of you received for this show. So let's start. I mean, as we've been saying, journalists Matt Taibbi and Michael Shellenberger are in receipt of a large cache of whistleblower documents communicating aspects of the spy program against the American people, which were unknown to most until just now. So why don't you tell us about it, Barbara?
Sure. I'm not going to go into all of the gory details. I'm just going to sort of outline the essence of what they found. But the lead of what they said is that this British person, who is identified as somebody by the name of Terp, a typical British name for an intelligence operative, appears to have been, or someone like her, a British intelligence analyst, appears to have been at the White House, the Obama White House, in 2017, right before this awful Biden administration began, and obviously, I mean, right before Trump took office, I'm sorry, and, you know, right at the point where they were trying to figure out what the hell happened, how did Trump get elected, and not only that, from the standpoint of the British, since all of these operations are international. That's one of the things we'll talk about today. One of the biggest problems that we have with the various exposés which people devote to the deep state, etc., is that they tend to look at it literally only from the standpoint of the United States, which is a huge mistake. The United States intelligence has functioned really since the end of World War II and the death of Franklin Roosevelt as almost, from the standpoint of Washington, with the limited interlude of Eisenhower and Kennedy, almost as a branch of British intelligence in many respects. The Patriots, you know, we used to talk about the CIA being divided into two pieces. One was that part of it, which was the Eastern establishment, which we used to call the bankers' CIA, which really identifies it for you. And the other part composed of patriots who managed to somehow get into the mix and into the agency. And it's always been crippled by that part of it, which is the bankers' CIA and aligned with the British. So anyway, what they found in these documents was that this Brit is sitting in the White House, and it is demanded that essentially a counter propaganda, counterintelligence program be set up, and that's really what it was. It was called, counter, hate speech, counter propaganda, counter all of the various things which they call it these days. That they set up something which would actually make it happen that 2016, in the form of Brexit, i.e., Britain asserting its sovereignty and leaving the globalist European Union, and Trump in the United States winning the election. And once again, if you remember his inauguration speech, he said, "The carnage ends here. I'm bringing America back. We're not part of some global imperial scheme." Basically, the demand from the Obama White House was, this can never happen again. Make sure it doesn't happen. Set up a program. And essentially what Taibbi and Shellenberger appear to have the documents for is the actual program as it evolved from 2017, 2018 into 2020, and the things which they have actually otherwise documented in the Twitter files and in the Facebook papers, which came out of the lawsuit by the Missouri and Louisiana attorneys general. And, you know, they seem to think that they're looking at something fairly new, i.e., that they're looking at something which evolved once they got access to the Twitter files. They're trying to account for everything which happened from the standpoint of what they found in the Twitter files to be a horrible censorship and political targeting and political warfare apparatus located through, you know, 3 or 4 of these private NGOs, the Stanford Observatory, the Election Integrity Unit, all of these other things, which were set up to avoid the constraint which exists in the United States Constitution against doing this type of censorship, surveillance, and, you know, political attack, because basically they wanted to go from a private sort of footing and not say it was the government that was involved. And of course, what they've proved through the Twitter files is that the government was involved in all sorts of ways directly with these NGOs and creating these censorship programs, which resulted, of course, in the famous or infamous kicking President Trump off of Twitter, you know, basically, you know, censoring the New York Post story about the infamous Biden laptop, and much else, you know, basically knocking out every conservative voice that they could find in the country. A great deal to be said about this in terms of the 2020 election rigging. And of course, it then goes on to essentially the censorship and surveillance regime, which was, you know, basically imposed after January 6th and also through COVID. And increasingly, of course, as everybody realizes, our freedoms, our constitutional rights have been being destroyed throughout this process as our opponent, you know, the regime, the globalist regime, which again is not limited to the United States, actually is imposing worldwide. And what they found with this, what this entity which was set up, which was called the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, is a very funny operation. That is that all sorts of FBI agents, Homeland Security agents, members of the Defense Department of the United States, especially special forces, very interesting, Israeli intelligence, British intelligence, were all involved in this entity, which was set up under a total intelligence cover. We're going to go out, they said, charitably. We'll set it up as a charity. And what we're going to do is we're going to go out and stop all of these hackings. And people may remember these hacking incidents that were going on against hospitals throughout the United States. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to go out and actually stop this hacking of hospitals, and we're going to find the cyber criminals who are doing this, and we're going to put them in jail. And all of these volunteers, which they got from the government, came forward to, you know, defend the hospitals. Not only that, it turns out rather dangerously that this group now is responsible for security for much of United States infrastructure, including nuclear power plants, dams, hospitals, etc. A danger which is a little outside the censorship, surveillance, and attacks on the Trump movement purview, but a major security threat nonetheless. And in this crazy thing which they did, which went across all of the Five Eyes intelligence countries worldwide, they set up this idea that the next thing we need to do in terms of stopping you know, Trump and stopping these bad deplorables and stopping these other people who use the internet to exchange ideas, which we view as subversive and terrible. What we've got to do is we've got to actually define part of the security of the United States as something which they called cognitive security, i.e., we've got to protect your brain from being hacked by Russians, Trump, whatever we don't like, etc., by using methods which will actually hack your brain, which is the irony in all of this. And so there's a lot in there in terms of that operation in particular. But what I found stunning is they just think this came into being right now, and it didn't. And that's what I have in my piece. This particular saga, which we're living through now, actually did begin in the Obama administration, but much, much earlier in the Obama administration, way back when in 2008 and 2009, as the financial collapse hit, and they were trying to figure out, how do we actually present this to the American population as something other than what it is. It was a collapse of the entire international financial system, which happened in 2008 and 2009, and really demanded very radical measures to be taken back then, which Lyndon LaRouche proposed, others fought for, to actually reorganize back then this entire mess, which we're now encountering, into some form, again, of an American system of political economy, a sovereign nation state, kicking the money changers out of the temple, so to speak, and actually going back to the types of things which have led this country to become, or led this country at one time to become, the most powerful economic force on the planet. So what happened with Obama was they started attacking the very idea of the internet, that is, that it was creating a whole lot of people who thought they had power because they could exchange ideas. And they said what these people are actually involved in is conspiracy theories. And the major, Obama actually put into power this guy, Cass Sunstein, who is a behavioral economist from the University of Chicago, who has a very imperial view of what you actually do to control populations. His idea is that you give a population a number of rigged choices within a set and frozen framework, and that's all they can choose from. But nonetheless, you tell them essentially that they have freedom of will and freedom of choice within the framework you've set up, and they think that they do if you condition them to actually believe that. It sounds a little bit like sort of what has been described as the social credit system in China. And, basically what Taibbi and others have said is that the Defense Department and other people who were talking about this said, yeah, that's basically what we would like to get set up here now in the present. And the reasons are very similar in some respects for their urgency, because we're facing yet another form of financial collapse rapidly coming upon us, which they're in very rough shape to handle at this point. They can't handle because they've been discredited. So way back when, Cass Sunstein started talking about how do we actually police the internet. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the government. We're going to have the government go out and hire private parties, and we want them to go into the chat rooms, which of course was what existed at that point in time. And we want to infiltrate the chat rooms, figure them out, and figure out ways to create what he called cognitive dissonance in the minds of people in the chat rooms, so that they can never come to a conclusion about anything. They're just left wandering down various paths that lead nowhere, and they end up in a state of confusion. That's what he was actually talking about way, way, way back then in 2008, 2009. And in my paper, I go through, in my post, I go through how this developed from that point on through the Arab Spring, through the coup in Ukraine, in which basically these methods were fully applied to a social process and brought back to the United States in the form of the beginnings of this attack, which this British intelligence analyst was present for the beginning of at the White House in 2017. Now, basically what the British did you know, in 2017 is, and 2015 really, is they set up a premier institution, which was called the Integrity Initiative. And when you look at that particular thing, it worked out of a charity, like all of these NGOs, a charity in Scotland called the Institute for Statecraft. It was funded totally by the British government, the Foreign Office of the British government, and by the British military. And that's the important thing, which this, I think, shocked Taibbi and Shellenberger, but it's really important to emphasize here that this is a military type of warfare, which is being applied to the citizens of the United States at this point. This is the type of stuff which psyops, counterinsurgency of the worst kind, off the books types of horrible operations done in warfare are now being turned back against populations. The way these guys in this, cyber, threat intelligence group describe it is that we went from doing operations against terrorists, throughout the world in terms of these types of operations, to going to operations against all populist movements worldwide. That's literally what they say and how they describe what it is they're doing. So, obviously, this is a big story. What they've put out so far, they've got a lot more which they're developing. But I wanted to point out that the evolution of this goes back much further. It is primarily a British operation. The British are very good at this stuff. And you take it, don't take it just from me, take it from the one of the worst people in the United States doing this type of warfare operation at this point, Eric Schmidt, the former head of Google, who says, in terms of these psychological warfare techniques, the British are far, far, far ahead of the United States. Now, NATO has actually, at this point, incorporated this into what they call the sixth branch of warfare. Let that sink in, the sixth branch of warfare. And that is the warfare for the human mind. That they think that this has to be a whole separate division of NATO's military doctrine, military expertise, etc. It's all done under the cover that the Russians have some mystical great power doing this, when the simple reality is that this is just an excuse for purposes of policing the population under conditions of crisis and national emergency. Now, this thing is very, very important, but it's also coming at a point where it's very clear that this group of people who are saying that Donald Trump is going to be a dictator are the people who are actually going for dictatorship right now in the United States. Everything they're saying about Trump and the Trump movement in terms of forecasting what Trump is about to do in terms of eliminating his opponents, so forth and so on, is exactly what they are presently doing.
Yeah, this is, the most recent incarnation, which is incredible, is an endless Washington Post opinion by Robert Kagan, who's best known as the husband of Tory Newland, the neocon in the State Department. So, people can find it, I assume. Maybe I should post that. But in any case, he goes through an endless article about how it's inevitable. We're headed for a dictatorship of Trump. It's modeled after the Hitler dictatorship in the way he describes it. And only if individuals take extraordinary actions that they would never otherwise think of taking can there be an exit from this dictatorship of Trump, which, other times he compares it to Julius Caesar, with paraphrasing Shakespeare's play, aspects of Shakespeare's play of that name.
And it's pretty clear that that's a direct call in what I call elitese language, and it's accompanied by these graphical images of distorted pictures of Trump, distorted pictures of other people with red blood.
And Julius Caesar is about 3 or 4 of those pictures.
Right, exactly, coming down. So it's pretty clear what the import of what it is they're calling for, thinking about doing things which you would never do. So they're completely freaked out, and they're gonna fight like the Dickens, far beyond anything they've done so far. And at the same time, all of these techniques which they're so focused on and so big on using are causing the population in the United States to increase its level of revolt and cohesion, really, behind Trump. So it's a conundrum they have. I found it quite interesting because Taibbi and Shellenberger went to Congress on Thursday and laid out this whole, what is effectively a brainwashing program, if you will. And then all of the Democrats in the Congress, if you actually listen to them, were completely wacko. They were all suffering, obviously, from Trump derangement syndrome. They were all exuding pure hatred. And, it was like, somebody walked into describing a huge and awful experiment in menticide, walked right into the scene of the crime and witnessed the people who actually have been victimized by this, but don't even realize that they've been victimized by it. So I thought that was pretty raw and pretty interesting. And if you want to really get a clinical sense of how this stuff works, you can go to C-SPAN and watch that hearing before the House Judiciary Committee on Thursday involving Taibbi and Shellenberger, and just watch these people. It's a pretty incredible show. But we're taking a slight break, and this is one of the things that I'm going to go back and forth with Tony about. We're taking really a slight break from our normal Saturday classes, which we've tried to devote as much as possible to what one might call heavy ideas rather than topical subject matter. And the reason why we took a break is kind of simple, because we're looking at how are we going to actually, in the midst of this kind of turning point, we're clearly at an inflection point. Most people are feeling it in various ways. We're, less than, a month and a half away from the Iowa caucuses, which are on the 15th. These guys are losing. The Ukraine war is lost. The ability to put stuff over on the population is increasingly non-existent. This drives them to desperate measures, and we've got to fight our way through this. And it should be obvious, it's obvious to me, that these Saturday classes where we talk about both the nature of the physical economy and how we get out of a depression condition, when we talk about the Renaissance and how classical culture actually shapes individuals and allows them to reach deep into inside themselves and find the creativity which allows us to fight this stuff, and locating ourselves in history, as we've done with Bob Ingram's classes. All of these things make it possible for you to become the type of revolutionary cadre, which is really what we're talking about, necessary to overcome this type of nonsense and actually save the country. So that's where I leave my opening, and we'll go back and forth a little bit more with Tony. He may want to comment on that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Want to say, it may be new to some people on the line with us today or not, but do you want to say something more about the significance? You have a bit already about the significance of the British role in this.
Well, look, the when I started out, I said it's always a mistake to look at things literally from the standpoint of the United States. If you look at Russiagate, most analyses of what happened to President Trump in the effort to smear him at the beginning of his term was actually part of an international operation designed to, by the British, ultimately leading up to the present war in Ukraine, if you look at it in retrospect, with the idea that Trump was going to change this campaign against Russia and China, which the British had undertaken as their new, not really new, but renewed historical emphasis. So, they tend to run these types of psychological warfare and censorship operations from the standpoint of how do you actually police an empire? How do you actually control populations? And they have over and over and over again asserted themselves in terms of the government of the United States based on the ideas of counterinsurgency, counterintelligence, the types of things which they actually use to control whole populations in Africa, most certainly, and other locations throughout the world. You find over and over and over again where you look at things which the United States allegedly did, bad things which we did, and you always find a British hand without any, further thought about it. More importantly, in terms of how people think about things, if you look at our elites, what you find is that most of them really don't have any idea of what one might call the American intellectual tradition, which is not located in the Enlightenment, as the British would have us, and how they've structured our history. It's actually located in the Italian Renaissance moving forward, as Trump has actually emphasized. And it's very contrary to everything that's taught through major British institutions. But we've had repeated instances in our government where people have actually functioned as overt British agents working within the United States government. The most famous one in the recent period is the thankfully departed Henry Kissinger, who spent some time at the relatively infamous British institution known as Chatham House, telling the Brits that during his tenure as the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon, he was actually working for the British and kept them better informed than any of his American colleagues. So that's the significance. It's both a significance in terms of how people think, which is at the root of everything we do, and a significance in terms of a dastardly turn, if you will, in our history, most certainly, since Roosevelt's death and, after World War II. Kissinger talked about repeatedly a central aspect of what he wished to do, which he said, my entire career has been devoted to attacking and wiping out what I call the American intellectual tradition. It's a pretty important tradition. It basically is what sort of drives our innovative character in terms of building things. It's what made Hamilton, probably the best economist in the world, next to, I would say, List and Lyndon LaRouche. That's what made Franklin someone who was called the Prometheus of the century by everybody who looked at him, because he was a scientist, first and foremost. Those are the types of things you're not taught in school, and that's largely because, of this intervening school of history, which has insisted that that American intellectual tradition simply does not exist.
And, just before we go to general discussion, you're dealing with two fundamentally different views of mankind and what a human being is. I mean, as Lyndon LaRouche began his intense opposition to Obama when it became clear, in part thanks to a front page expose in Time magazine, that the thinking for the Obama administration was being done by the so-called behavioral economists, of whom Cass Sunstein, who Barbara mentioned, was one, but there were quite a few of them. They came in there and ran the government, a large part of it, and their view of mankind was just unbelievable. Behavioral economists came out of a combination of London, the City of London, and University of Chicago. But University of Chicago, where of course also Obama taught, is a free. It was founded to be a free trade hell on earth, basically, and that's for the most part what it's been, and thereby very close to London. So that's where this bunch came out of. I read a bunch of their writings at that time in 2008, 2009. And one of them, for instance, I can't remember if it was particularly Cass Sunstein who wrote it, I think it was, said, very indicative really of them. He said, people say you can't place a money value on human life, but that's completely untrue. You can very readily place a money value on human life, because you take two jobs, and let's say, this was very similar to an example he actually used. I mean, one job is underwater diving, where if you do it long enough, you're going to die because of getting the bends or some other condition. And another job is one that has the same amount of exertion, takes the same amount of time, but it's not going to kill you. So you just compare the wages offered for those two jobs, and there you have the value of human life. That's what it is. So these were the people who were running the administration for Obama, and you see, their viewpoint is not the American; it's antithetical. It's the oligarchical. We could say more about it, but it's the oligarchical view of man. So that's maybe enough to provoke discussion.